Hello, everyone, and welcome to our webinar today. We are going to be looking at economic development priorities using key insights from survey data that we used in our 2024 book, Economic Development Marketing and Priorities, third edition. I'm Alissa Sklar with Sklar Consulting, and I'm delighted to be doing this webinar with Anatalio Ubalde from Size Up. Hey, Anatalio.
Hey, Lisa.
Exciting to be doing a webinar together again. I'm
Yes,
looking forward to this. We've done this a few times, haven't we?
we have.
So with that, we are going to start off here today by talking about priorities. What is it that we mean when we're looking at priorities? And won't surprise you too much that economic development organizations everywhere have their top list and their mission, their mandate, the things that they are going to spend most of their time and their team are going to be focusing on primarily. That is resources, budget dollars, team members as well. So we can bring us up to the next slide here. And what we're going to do when we talk about priorities is look at the things that are most commonly asked for, the services that people are most familiar with. So that will include all kinds of things. I'm not going to name them because then it will seem like I'm listing them in a particular order. So that's not what I'm going to do here, but you will know what those are. And what we'd really like to do at the top of this is ask you, if you are at an economic development organization, what do you think are the top priorities for your organization? You can put them in order. So we're going to launch a poll here that you should be able to see on your screen. And we're going to ask you to put up to 5. There's multiple choice. You can choose the ones that you've got and let us know what are the priorities for you. Interesting. So we're seeing business retention and expansion up at the top. We're seeing workforce development a little bit below in second place. Business attraction, site selection, assistance is in third place over there. Other things that we're seeing are entrepreneurship and small business development. I guess we've got almost, workforce attraction still up there, community development, marketing. There may be things, of course, we didn't list, right, that other people might have voted on, but this is interesting.
Yes.
Okay, so we're not going to comment yet on that because we're going to come up to that in a moment. But we'd like to tell you a little bit about where you can find more detail about these things and others. And that is in the book that we published with the Financial Times in 2024. This is Economic Development Marketing and Priorities. This is the third edition. And as I said, this is available for free in a PDF format through the FDI Insight pages on FT locations. We are also happy to provide a number of people like at IEDC got some hard copies of these things as well if they attended our session. And this book followed up on 2 earlier books, didn't it? I mean, this is something that you in particular started a long time ago.
That's right. It started from this question I was asking myself, which is, are we economic developers doing it right? Are we focused? The original one was really focused around marketing. Are we spending our dollars in ways that produce the greatest value for us? Because there were so many people getting up on stage at conferences saying, this is what works. And they were saying that based on numbers that they made up in their heads. So this was our first effort to figure out, let's actually quantify and measure what actually works.
And it's interesting because it means that we have this very unusual data set, longitudinal data of the profession over time. So we can look at how this maybe has shifted over time. So and in today's webinar, we're really going to be talking about the priorities segment. We do have a second webinar later on that we'll talk to you about on economic development marketing from the data in the book.
So I wanted to have something for my dear friend who is a Canadian that relates to what we're trying to do here, which is to understand, as Wayne Gretzky says, skate to where the puck is going, not where it has been. And that's what this data is going to show us. And we've got some clear goals from this and what we're trying to achieve. And this is what you should be able to answer by the time we're done with this webinar. First is, are you future-proofing your career by keeping up with the changing trends and priorities in economic development? And how have priorities changed for US? But actually, Alissa is going to give us some insights for Canadians also. And finally, are you lagging behind your colleagues in economic development? So we're going to start with a question, and that question is, these are the rankings, or these are potential rankings, and we want to see how well you are aligned and in touch with what matters with your colleagues. So please take this poll, and we'll see how many of you get it right. Here are the results. Now, for those of you, now, not everybody can be a winner on this, but if you chose option A or option C, you're right. Now, I'm sure you're wondering, how is it that two answers can be right? Well, actually, it's because these are the results of two different polls that we did, one 2 years apart. And we'll explain that a little bit more. We got a slide to show that. Most of the folks here have got it right.
Interesting. Okay. So business retention and expansion seems to have the edge here. And I'll let you lead us into the data.
All right, so here it is. This is kind of the big the important slide if you were looking for one that you wanted to take a picture of your screen. Here it is. These are the results. So this is what you and your peers have identified of economic developers of what are your top priorities for your organization. Coming in at a very strong number one, and we saw it from the results, both of this group that just took this poll and also for what you assumed was the result, and you were right. Business retention and expansion is the leader. And this is the first time, generally, BRE and attraction tended to be very close. This is the first time in all of the series of research that we've done that BRE has been in first place, and this time it's really pulled away to be in first place by itself. In second place, business attraction, followed by entrepreneurship and small business development and workforce development. Exactly the same top choices that everybody did. So we're seeing the same thing in 2025. These are the top priorities. These are followed by community development, marketing. And marketing, we should point out, is not really so much an economic development program, but something that is done across many industries. Followed by workforce attraction, redevelopment, real estate development, support of local government, placemaking, and so on. Now, what I want to talk about next is really about kind of what are we seeing in the analysis? And so the first major trend, and it's a big trend, is we're seeing this trend toward things that are local. So local economic development. In fact, when you look at this, 4 of the 5 top priorities have a local aspect to it of supporting local businesses or local residents. These include BRE, entrepreneurship and small business development, workforce development, and community development. The only economic development priority of the top 5 priorities that's external is business attraction and site selection assistance. And we could also point out that some of site selection assistance could be helping local businesses also. Another interesting trend was what's in the top 3 is entrepreneurship and small business development. Now, a very interesting and something that we've not seen in any of our professional lives. So I think probably everybody who is on this webinar, this is the most we've ever seen for as long as we've worked, is this huge boom in entrepreneurship, in new businesses starting. So if you look at this graph, you'll see this is the number of new businesses that are growing or are opening over time. And so we started to see things kind of a little bit flat in 2019. And this is by year. If I showed this to you by half year or by quarter, you would see some dip that happened when the COVID pandemic started. But even within 2020, there was this huge explosion of new businesses starting. And Alissa and I had this theory like, oh, maybe this is just this weird thing that happened once, or we're seeing a weird COVID spike. That is not the case because now we see what the data is for 2020, 2021, 2022, and 23. What we realize now is that the number of new businesses started, it's the new normal. What has happened after COVID, kind of that peak of 2020, has become our new normal. And this represents a huge opportunity. I think that economic developers have figured this out, that small business and entrepreneurship is their future. And this is a big opportunity or an important part of their future. I'm not saying it's everything, but it's definitely an important thing. I don't know if you wanted to comment at all on that, Alissa, or I can move on to some of the other trends.
Well, just to say that the data really holds true in the sense that we recognize, and I think there has been a large recognition that these local businesses are really the lifeblood of every economy, right? Like this is where jobs come from, that people who are local are likely going to support the local sports teams. They're likely to work with their other local organizations for collaborations, to show up on the boards of different things. So this really is also about community building as well. And it's really nice to see this recognition happening in a very direct way in this data.
And one of the things that's happened is when there was the shutdown and a lot of people were working from home or businesses were closed, it became acutely obvious just how important the local businesses are for the local economy. And I think that cultural, that professional shift has sustained. So thanks for that. And I'm hearing it from so many economic developers. So here's another big trend, which is the trend of labor. And we saw that these were big movers in terms of focus. We know it's still important. We can tell it from the results of today's poll. So workforce development, the fourth biggest priority. And by the way, this wasn't such a big priority when we were doing this analysis back in the early aughts, right?
Mhm.
But now you've got workforce development and workforce attraction, which is something that's frankly a bit of a new strategy in economic development, moving their way up. Now, let's figure out, well, why? Why is this important? And so when we look at the unemployment rate in the United States, we have been staying at what we thought before, what economists thought before was below full employment. I don't know if that even makes sense as a term, that you can have more than full employment. But the idea was at 5%, that 5% is what you need so that people can move from job to job. And so you don't have massive spikes in the cost of labor. Well, we've been living below 5% as a country for a long time. These are the lowest rates we've seen. So what does this mean? As the labor is incredibly tight, communities realize this is a challenge for them. So they've got to, through workforce development, upskill or create skills. Or another approach is about trying to find labor that is in other places.
It's an interesting one, actually, because I think that during COVID, people recognized how important this was, but this says staying power. This is really important. And we're also simultaneously seeing this shift where the metric that economic developers often use for success, which is jobs created, has really changed in a world where remote work is a very much a reality. And I know people talk about getting people back to the office or whatever, but we know that they're remote workers. And that means that you might attract a company to your community, but you aren't necessarily creating jobs in your community, or vice versa. You might not get the community in your community, the company to come to your community, but you can create a haven and a great environment for people who can live there and work there, but not necessarily drive to an office there.
Lisa, you bring up a really important trend, and it's something that I think as a profession we weren't really thinking that much about, which
Right.
is we need to rethink what a job is, right? Because the old model of economic development is that the job must be in our city to create wealth in our community. But that's not true anymore because you could be a remote worker for another company and you're still working, you're still bringing in those dollars into your community as a remote worker. I think that this also brings up another I would actually have to say, kind of a tricky challenge for economic developers. You brought up, how have economic developers traditionally measured success? They've measured it in jobs created. Well, look at this graph. Like, we won. We won. We've created the jobs. Pretty much, if you want a job, you can get one in the United States. I mean, more or less. But there's this tension, I think, with that issue, which is, and I'd say it's also the tension between traditional economic development goals and business goals. If you go and ask a business, what is your goal? It's not to create more jobs. Like, that's the last thing they want to do, because employees are oftentimes one of their most expensive
Course.
costs, right? So our businesses and economic developers, are we aligned around our goals? Because if businesses actually want more productivity or more profit, but economic developers want more jobs, does that make sense? And even more so in a context when we're at full employment. So,
And of course, this is particularly germane when we're talking about office work or work that can be done remotely, engineering, development, coding, software, all of that stuff. If this is manufacturing or service, people need to be showing up. And one of the really interesting things that we saw more of a focus on because of the pandemic that I hope has legs is reskilling programs, retention programs. So a recognition that to get people to staff those on-site positions means that you need to find those people from somewhere, attract them from somewhere, keep them when they get there, or else help existing workers reskill so they can meet the new demands of, sectors that are rapidly introducing things like robotics or AI or whatever those things are as they become more sophisticated.
right.
So that brings us to our next slide, where we're going to be talking about placemaking. And as you can actually see on this slide, as we're talking about things like quality of life and placemaking still finding their way, although those are lower priorities, they still had a huge relative increase as we looked at the data. So placemaking increased by 68% and real estate development by 92%. And we saw that shaping in communities and public spaces to improve vitality also became a really big focus. So part of this is making sure that you have the things in place, the facilities on the one hand, whether it's offices or warehouses or whatever those kinds of things are, the real estate development side of things. And this doesn't specifically acknowledge housing, affordable housing, but I know with the employee economic developers that I'm working with, we definitely are seeing the affordable housing being one of the things that they're talking about. Anatalio, I see that you just put a note in there that there's something we should mention is, as we're talking, we are going to be taking questions at the end. And as we're doing this, if you have questions, please put them in the Q&A. There is a chat also, and this is one of the funny things about Zoom is it sometimes gets a bit, we're going to be looking primarily in the Q&A. If you could put any questions or comments that you have in there, I think that would be very helpful. So again, some interesting relative increases in prioritization, recognition about how important these things also are to be successful as an economic development organization. Now, this was an interesting one because we saw some shifts in age as one of the things that we asked in the survey. And we saw that entrepreneurship and small business development was a higher priority for those who were under 40 and over 49, which is an interesting, what happened to those folks in their 40s? Interesting questions, because that was really one of the things that we saw that really shifted. We also saw, and this is perhaps less surprising, is that marketing for economic development purposes was really a much higher priority for the younger folks who answered our survey, those in their 20s. There it actually ranked third, which is very interesting. 30 and up ranked at eighth. So we saw that it was the young economic development respondents in our survey who really pulled this up, and a recognition, which is some of the things that I've been hammering through with our clients and trying to impress in presentations and training over the years that I've been in this field, is that your brick and mortar size does not have to limit your impression online Doesn't have to limit your success, even with larger companies, larger organizations. And it doesn't have to limit the amount of support that you can offer, the ways you can offer those kinds of things to your existing businesses and to promote any programs that you've actually got. So that was really important. Another one that was kind of interesting is we saw a shift in a focus on financing. So for those who were over 60, this was in ninth place. For those who were under 60, it was in 15th place. So definitely it was the more senior folks in our survey who saw the importance of that one. It's still a high priority, but just something that is worth acknowledging that age did have an impact on how people responded to these things.
Absolutely. So, listen, when we were doing this research, we got into this conversation and we were asking this question. Well, when we do the survey in 2021, this was still kind of, we were heavily impacted by a lot of people working from home. Was it, on during COVID? And so we revisited this at the end of 2023. I think it was November, December, to do the analysis again. And what we found is, no, it wasn't a uniquely 2021 thing of how people prioritized. In fact, there was very little change across the priorities of you economic developers. You can see this, clearly there was some change from 2011 to 2021, but mostly things stayed within the same general ranking. There were some things that moved up, some things that moved down. But overall, you can look at it. There was a definitely a bit of a decrease around community development, but overall, what we're seeing is that these are the priorities of economic developers. And if we want more insight into this, the survey that was done by all of you now in 2025 really confirms it. Lisa, you want to talk you and I
No,
spent time talking about this.
Yeah, no, I think that's okay. I think we can move on to talking about structure, size, and urbanization because we did add these additional criteria in there, and there were some interesting shifts in how people answered the data about their priorities. So we could take a look at population size. Not too surprisingly, the larger areas were more focused on foreign direct investment. Doesn't mean that they were absent even in the small communities, but that is definitely a notable shift here. And interestingly enough, when we look at Canada, because a lot of the results here, we're looking at US data, but a lot of this actually was relevant for Canadian respondents as well. And certainly we saw definitely a focus on foreign direct investment in the larger areas and in regions, regional economic development being important in Canada as well. Redevelopment or downtown revitalization, not too surprisingly, also was more of a feature for the smaller communities, a recognition maybe that this is a way to attract workforce, that they have things that they need to do for placemaking, I think is important.
Absolutely.
Business retention and expansion, biggest for the kind of those between 25K and 100,000 people, doing everything that they can to hold on to the small businesses, which hopefully would be robust in those areas and a place where they're looking to make it more robust. And community development being really significant for the smaller communities, that this is, again, a part of placemaking, part of their challenge, retaining businesses, also attracting, but keeping workers in place as well. And I'll pass the next one over to you.
This one, you want to take it? I'm happy to if you want me
Why
to.
don't you go ahead and talk about regions?
Okay. So we also were wondering if there were variations by where you are in the country. And although there's, again, most of the trends and prioritizations are very similar. Like BRE just tends to be very high everywhere. But we wanted to look at where there were significant variations. And one is workforce attraction. Boy, look at the Midwest. That was a very important part for them in terms of their economic development priorities versus the Northeast, where it was a much lower priority. Or workforce development, which is a much higher priority in the South, than it was for the West. You can see these ones in bold, and you can see placemaking was really all over the place, a higher priority in the West and Midwest than in the South and the Northeast. Or real estate development, the Northeast being very big versus in the West where it was low. So we did see variations. Alissa talked about the ones that are by age, but we also see it by geography, and we pulled out some of those other variations, which we talked about when we saw that bar graph. So with that, we'll now kind of talk about what are some of the key takeaways. And Alissa, I'll pass it to you.
All right, thanks. So definitely we see here, as we've been saying, focus on local business has really become key for economic developers. That workforce remains very important. Entrepreneurship emerging as a new or big opportunity, and also as a really high priority here, particularly for the younger ED pros and those who are over 49. Now, attraction and site selection, foreign direct investment, definitely a high priority. It has seen decline. It's hard to know if that means people are doing less of it or simply that the business retention, the BR&E, is more important. So it's definitely there is very vital, but we're seeing it kind of taking, maybe a second place to the local business and entrepreneurship. Interestingly enough, the pandemic didn't change priorities that much, so that'll be interesting to monitor going forward. We definitely see younger economic developers recognizing the power of marketing. Does finance decline as a priority? We'll see what happens as older ED pros retire. And also, not too surprisingly, the population size and region had a really big impact on priorities. And I know, Anatalio, this brings us up to the end of our half hour. We're going to stay on to take some questions. We recognize some of you may have to step away. We are going to be following up, as I said, with the link to the recording. We'll put our slide deck in there as well for those of you who are interested in seeing that. We do have the second part of this webinar coming up where we take a look at the data on economic development marketing and show you that what we learned since the 2008 books straight up to the last survey that we did in 2023 to look at huge shifts in marketing, especially as the world has changed dramatically in those times. And so we'd love to see you there as well. And there's another webinar coming up on February 5th there. So you'll be able to see that, and we'll include those links. We would love to hear from you. So again, I do see some questions coming in the Q&A here. Thank you for putting those in there. Anatalio, there's an interesting question here from Elizabeth. I'm going to turn that over to you to answer. Jackie asks, where can we secure a copy of the book? It is available as a PDF for a free download on FDI Insights. I'm happy to place the link in the follow-up email as well. And if you want to get an actual hard copy, then you can reach out to us, and we're happy to connect with you on that, either at an upcoming conference or we can talk about other possibilities. And do you want to take the question here from Elizabeth?
Yes, I do. First, I just want to point out that we put the links to the next two webinars that are coming up. Please feel free to click on those. You will definitely get like what marketing is working and how it connects to these priorities. So Elizabeth, you asked such a great question, which is, how are our thoughts on the 10-year span between 2011, 2021, 23, and how does that represent the aging up of economic developers? I think you're absolutely right. So we're definitely seeing some trends, and depending on where you are on this call, and which is kind of what is your age and how long have you been in the profession, we just see more and more that things are changing. And I think that there are also generational shifts. So I want to talk a little bit about that. One place that we're seeing it is you saw that finance was really a priority for those who are older economic developers. What does that mean? As these people age out, they've got what, at most maybe 5 years of time before they retire. That may not be as much of a focus of economic development. Although part of me also wants to challenge that with say, maybe it's a different type of economic development finance will be focused on in future generations. I also think that we need to address the fact that the values and the context that younger economic developers, and when I say younger, I really mean kind of the younger half, which could be those who are, 40 and under, they've grown up under a different context of what they prioritize. So these are folks who, I mean, they have had this experience of like going to the cool local businesses. And I think that, like how they spend their time and how they do that is very different than maybe some older folks who've grown up with different types of experiences. But what I can also tell you is that we're looking at larger trends. That is not the case. It's not like, oh, if you're an old economic developer, this is how you behave, because that is also not what I found to be true. Closing thought on that is also that I think that the younger generations have discovered, well, they grew up in an era where they were solving more of their own problems, answering their own questions. They weren't going to other people for their answers. And so I think that that has also impacted how they do their economic development and how they see their own local resources being places to succeed. And I think that that's about supporting local entrepreneurs who are also solving their problems. I mean, this is a generation that was raised on the internet, and they know how to get things done themselves.
Interesting. Okay. We have a question from Bill asking how these results compare to the data from Canada. And we don't have as much longitudinal data for Canadians, of course. I can say that the focus on workforce also remains that kind of very dominant part of the discussion for economic developers across Canada. And that we also see a interest. I can't tell you if it has been there before, because the first time we asked this here as well, but definitely an interest in business retention, local business, and entrepreneurship is also something that we're seeing. It's a very robust trend here in Canada as well. Although foreign direct investment, certainly in the big metro areas and regions, does remain absolutely important.
Related to that, why don't we answer this other question that just came in about why is there such a focus on small business and entrepreneurship? And I think that you started that conversation really well, right? Alissa, you talked about how, well, we got this intense focus on it as we saw our neighborhood businesses during COVID closing down or people losing their jobs. And these weren't some, kind of remote ideas. These are our neighbors. And those were impacting us. But I think there's another element for that is just that economic developers have figured out the math on this. And your local businesses, this is really where the local wealth creation happens, right? So with a big business that has a headquarters outside of your city, that is resulting in wealth leaving your community and going to the headquarters, right? Or to the CEOs or owners that don't live in your community, versus the value of the wealth creation from locally owned businesses, small businesses and entrepreneurs who they go to the local restaurants. They take their clothes to the local dry cleaner. They eat at the local restaurants, all these types of things. And as the folks on Market Watch always talk about, 70% of our economy is based on consumer spending. So if that consumer spending is happening and it's staying in our community and the owners of the businesses in our community, well, that's the economic multiplier that we as economic developers all want to see. So small business and entrepreneurship is the best return on investment of your economic development efforts. And I think that's why BRE and entrepreneurship and small business have moved up as priorities.
Excellent point. It's the one that we're most likely to see close up, right? Absolutely.
So there's another question that asks about how these priorities impact marketing. So maybe you can give a preview to our next webinar.
Absolutely. So we're going to really go into much more depth, look at how this responses to this have shifted over time as different marketing tactics and strategies became more important. Certainly the use of online marketing, social media, they talk a little bit about email marketing. It's almost like the stepchild that we don't spend as much time paying attention to, but still very relevant. And so we're going to take a deep dive into what people have responded and said that were important to them, what they spend their money on. We'll look at budget dollars. And then we also did a parallel survey with site selection consultants, and we asked them what kinds of things got their attention, what were important to them. So how do we compare those kinds of things? And there's some surprises in there. So we do look forward to sharing that with you. So that'll be on February 13th. We hope you can join us then. Again, if you can't make the webinar itself because the time doesn't suit you, register anyway. That way you ensure that you get a copy of the slide deck and the video in a follow-up email. We look forward to engaging with you guys online. Feel free to reach out and connect to us on LinkedIn. Anatalio, it's always fun to do this with you.
Yes, I enjoyed it. And I will give you another preview for the next webinar, which is we're also seeing another trend, which is that we were talking about programs, right? So priorities influence programs and services. And we'll talk about how marketing is becoming a service. So
Ooh, yes.
marketing as a program so actually where you're accomplishing the priority in the program through your marketing.
Looking forward to it. Thank you all for taking time out of your busy days to join us. We love seeing you online in this forum, and we look forward to seeing you in February as well. Take care and have
Thank
a
you,
great day.
everybody. Please reach out to both of us, connect with us on LinkedIn, and click on those links for the next webinars.